Good morning, good morning, good morning. I know I'm ahead of time, but I just can't wait. This is far too exciting. What a fabulous crowd. What a fabulous morning. Thank you all so much. My name is Jim DeWald. I'm the Dean of the Haskayne School of Business. And I would like to start with the territorial acknowledgement. So I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. This includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, Piikani, and Nagainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and the Goodstoney First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. This is the Enbridge Research and Action Series, a series that we're so proud of that we've had for quite a few years at the Haskayne School of Business. This morning in particular, we will be speaking about the role of collaboration in energy transition. And I just look around, like what a stunning crowd we've got here. Lots of very important people here, a full room, and it's really thrilling to have this. Isn't it kind of cool to be back finally in this kind of a setting? And now we're bringing back, Calgary is back to being an early morning city. Although, the traffic was a little outrageous coming down here. I'm not really used to that at that time of morning. I will often get up at this time, but nobody's going to the university at 7 in the morning. So a few housekeeping notes before we start the program. If the fire alarm rings, remain calm. Listen to the instructions, which should come over the intercom or by staff through the microphones like this. If you are prompted to evacuate, use the marked exits, which in this case is very simple, just straight out the front door here. Do not use elevators in any emergencies. Now, washrooms can be found along the west side of the building, so that's out around that side over there. I just ask that everybody please turn your devices to silent, because you're certainly going to want to hear what's going on here. And I also want to note that this series has brought together influential researchers and practitioners and industry experts to discuss leading-edge sustainability research. And you can look at our website for the last Research in Action webinar, which was entitled ESG and Risk, Lessons from TransAlta's Transition, which is another very interesting topic. But today, is another special day for Enbridge because we've just confirmed an arrangement with Enbridge and a very generous $1 million gift to the school. Thank you very much, Enbridge. Now this includes sponsoring some of the space in Matheson Hall, including a new classroom, the Monaco Family Classroom, which is great, and the Enbridge Concourse. Also support for our Creative Destruction Lab Rockies and ongoing support for the Enbridge Research and Action Speaker Series. Enbridge's support is helping to build learning environments for future leaders to advance innovation and engage our community. You know, the thing that separates Haskayne from other business schools in Canada is our connection to the business community. And we're very, very proud of that, and it's very important to us. And I just want to say that sometimes there's things that you might want to say about the school that you might be wondering how we'll receive it. Talk to us, because it's really important that we have this dialogue ongoing and that we make sure that we're listening to the community and that we're doing what we can to support the community. So we're very grateful for all of our community partners, including Enbridge, and it's what really makes us a cut above the rest. So we have a panel here today, which each of the members are going to introduce themselves a little more. Rhona DelFrari is the Chief Sustainability Officer and Senior Vice President of Stakeholder Engagement at Cenovus Energy. Are you Executive Vice President? Yes.
No.
No, okay.
I'm on the executive team.
Yeah,
it's confusing.
Amberly Dooley is the Director of Policy at Pathways Alliance. And if you don't know who's sitting at the center, you must not be a Calgarian, because it's our very own Dr. Bob, a professor of strategy at the Haskayne School of Business and the leader of so many different initiatives we have. With that, I'm just going to hand it over to them and over to you, Bob, but please give our panel a warm welcome.
So I'm Dr. Bob Schulz. I'm in the Haskayne School of Business now. This is year 50. And I can't say I hope for another 50, but certainly another 25 or 30 anyway. Because there's still things to be done. And one of the things to be done is to get reconnected with our community. You are our community. And we're coming out of COVID. And so we welcome you all here this morning to get back to the way Calgary used to be. This is the way things are networked in Calgary. So I'm going to introduce Rhona first, one of my star global EMBA students from a few years ago. And she'll do some self-introduction, and we'll have Amberly do a little introduction, a little bit more than what Jim had in terms of what their role is. And then we'll go for some of the target questions, which I pose, and sit back and listen.
Thanks, Dr. Bob. And I hope that there's plans to celebrate your 50 years at the school. That's a pretty big deal.
Well, we'll figure that out someplace along the way. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks everyone for coming. At Cenovus, I lead our sustainability efforts as well as our stakeholder engagement portfolio. So some of my team is in the audience here. And from the stakeholder engagement side, that means government affairs, various levels of government, Indigenous engagement and reconciliation, communications, anything to do with communities and stakeholders across all of our operating areas, but also stakeholders that have a say or care anything about energy, climate, and sustainability issues. So basically everybody in the world, pretty much, is under my portfolio there. And I've been with Cenovus since before it launched as a company. I started with Encana. And prior to that, I spent nearly a decade and a half as a journalist. So I know there's some other former journalists and actual journalists in the room today. So that's kind of me.
So Amberly, introduce yourself, and then we'll get on with some of my target questions, which are pretty simple questions, because we have some complicated answers that we need to understand more about.
For sure. I am not one of Dr. Bob's former students, but I am the Director of Policy at Pathways Alliance. At Pathways Alliance, Rhona will tell you guys more about what we do, but I will say that it's not all about the foundational project, which you may have heard about. So I'm part of the external relations team. In that team, we have our comms group. We have a group that's focused on stakeholder and government relations, and then my team is the policy team. We work on the regulation and the policy that will help enable some of the transition that we're looking for, as well as all of the other aspects of oil sands operations, so everything from mine water release to scheme approvals for our in-situ operations. So we've got kind of a broad portfolio of the regulatory pieces of the puzzle in my team.
Thank you very much for both of you. And the questions are going to be pretty simple. What is Pathways Alliance? Why and how? So Rhona, let's start out with you. What is the transition, the energy transition from competition to collaboration and from old energy to new energy? Help us out.
Simple. I thought you said you were doing simple questions. So yeah, let's start with what is energy transition. And I have to say right off the top that I'm kind of done with the argument about the definition or the term itself. It doesn't matter if it's energy transition or energy transformation or energy diversification or whatever. We're all in this room very familiar that the world is going through one of those, pick a word that you want to use. And what that means to me is that at the same time that we are striving to reduce emissions to get to net zero in the future, which, I don't hear a lot of conversations with people saying we don't have to care about that anymore. I think we're kind of past that, so it's about the how, as you mentioned. We also have to be thinking about energy security. And so I think we can't be having conversations in silos. We have to be talking about how do we become lower, zero carbon in everything that we do, not just our energy production and the various life cycle of energy, but how do we get there in everyday life? And at the same time, how do we make sure that as the world's population continues to grow, that everybody around the world can live the kind of lifestyle we all live? We're very fortunate here in Canada. We don't wake up in the morning and think about, where am I going to find my energy? And so every conversation has to be about both energy security and addressing climate change together, because if you have those conversations separately, then there's some challenges that arise, and we're seeing that globally right now. And then what is Pathways, and how does Pathways fit into that energy transformation, transition, diversification? So Pathways, the Pathways Alliance, it was initially called the Oil Sands Pathways to Net Zero Alliance, which was way too long to say, so we changed it. It's 6 companies, and those 6 companies are the bulk of the oil sands production, so 95% of oil sands production. The other 5%, it doesn't mean those companies aren't interested, they're just smaller companies, and so absolutely happy to work with them as well. And we, a couple of years ago now, made it over a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago probably, some of our CEOs came together and said, okay, enough is enough. We've all been working on emissions reduction. We've reduced our emissions intensity by a significant amount over the years, but we need to move faster with this. There's a lot of pressure on the energy sector, and in the oil sands in particular, that's not a secret to people in this room, to address our emissions, because we do a great job with everything else when it comes to environment, social, and governance. And I've been around the world talking to investors and insurers and others, and they none of them disagree with that. They're like, yeah, you have this. In Canada, ESG, you've got it all. It's your GHG problem, especially in the oil sands. And so the CEOs said, okay, let's throw everything we have at this, and let's agree to collaborate, share our learnings when it comes to addressing the absolute emissions from our production of oil sands. Let's tackle this. And so we have a plan to do it. We don't have all the solutions in that plan, but between now and 2050, our companies, you have to make this commitment to be part of Pathways Alliance, is that our companies are committed to getting to net zero from our production of oil sands by 2050. And we do it by decade, and we've got, the first decade, this decade that we're in right now, we're already fairly far into this decade. It's a smaller percentage of the reductions, and then in the 2030s there's a bigger chunk, because right now we're still doing some feasibility studies and trying to figure out what the best technologies will be to get us there. 2040s we should be at the implementation stage. 2030s implementation. 2040s continue with the implementation of things like carbon capture and storage, which we'll talk more about later as the foundational project. And then some of the things that we're not sure about right now, because that's still quite a ways away. If you think back, it's only been over a couple of decades that we've done steam-assisted gravity drainage, the predominant means of oil sands production now. So when you think back, we didn't even know how to do that a couple decades ago. So the expectation that we would have all the solutions today on how to get to net zero, that's not realistic. And that's why we need people like academics and other entrepreneurs and people that are in this room to help us come up with those solutions. So that's the commitment of Pathways. And Amberly and I will talk a little bit more about some of the potential solutions, but it is a commitment, and it is a very public one. And so sometimes I'll hear criticism of, oh well, these companies aren't really serious about doing it. When you're a publicly traded company of the size of the companies that are part of Pathways, and you make this commitment publicly, you're committed. And so we're getting there. I'm on the steering committee for Pathways, and we meet multiple times a week as a steering committee. And there's a whole bunch of people in this room from our various companies, besides the Pathways Alliance staff, that meet also multiple times. And one of my meetings is every Friday at 7 a.m. with all of the CEOs from all 6 companies. And that's been going on for over 2 years now. So that's the level of commitment that we have.
Pretty big what? And a long time frame. Amberly, can you continue to elaborate on exactly why we need to do this?
For sure. I mean, I think Rhona's made some really good points about the need to stay relevant. There are commitments that have been made by Canada. There's been commitments made at COP, where everyone is working towards globally achieving a decarbonized economy. And really at Pathways, what our staff, and with the direction and support and massive involvement of all of the member companies and their representatives, there's like something like 200 people that kind of work with us, and it's even more than that, I think, really. And what we're trying to accomplish is how can Canada and the source of energy we have in Alberta, the oil sands, be part of that solution and that movement towards that net zero goal or ambition or whatever. At Pathways, it's a plan. It's not an ambition, it's not a goal, it's a plan. And one of the things that we have looked at is how can the oil sands players incent the innovation, work with the member companies, work with the academics, work with the innovation think tanks to really gather the technologies that we need, and a lot of them that already exist, in order to help make that transformation or transition or whatever the heck you want to call it possible. And one of the key pieces, obviously, is continuing to work with the government. So working with the government of Canada, working with the government of Alberta, and making sure that we have the frameworks, both the regulatory frameworks and the fiscal incentive frameworks in place to make this happen. Decarbonizing the oil sands is it's not a business proposition. There's not money to be made in removing the CO2 from the product. And so what we're really trying to do is make it so that we can be part of that solution and work towards that decarbonized economy while continuing to have a business case for our operations, which would make the students at Dr. Bob's class very happy, but also recognizing that it's part of the commitment that's been made. And when those public commitments are made, you need to work towards them. And so we've done things like invest in the foundational project. So the foundational project is kicked off. The FEED studies are in progress. We've got the exploration license announced. And so we're working towards so for foundational project, I should back up. The foundational project is where the oil sands players have committed to putting in capture facilities at their major, both oil sands mining and in situ oil sands operations. Those capture facilities will capture CO2 and put it into a trunk line, which will run from the Fort McMurray region of Alberta down to the Cold Lake region of Alberta, where it will be injected underground into saline aquifers, where it will be permanently stored and sequestered. So sometimes there's questions about, is that feasible? Yes, actually, quite feasible. We've been doing injection in Alberta for decades and doing it very well. And so we have a great framework in place. We just need to expand that framework to encapsulate carbon capture and storage, and then get the structure we need to help make it happen. So it's a lot of questions about what, but also about the how. And so I think the really cool part of being part of Pathways is that we've identified the what, now we're figuring out and implementing on the how, and there's action being taken.
So since we're on the how, we'll do another round of responses here, and then we're going to have some open time for people from the audience here to ask questions. So on how. So Rhona, what is needed from the energy companies to support the transformation in Canada?
So I think the first thing that's needed is what we've already alluded to, and it is the willingness to collaborate. And, when you think about our 6 companies that are in this, and again, we're working with many others, but we're fierce competitors. And, it's not always, and we all have very different cultures. That's a shock to everybody in here, I'm sure, because, everyone thinks the oil and gas industry is all the same. But we have found a way to overcome our different cultures, our competitive interests. And what I hear over and over again, and what we talk about at the steering committee, and what I hear from the CEOs repeatedly, is nobody can be a big winner in this and nobody can be a big loser in this. And so we all have to have a compromise and to be able to move fast. And so I think that we sometimes underestimate the importance of that. And I have not had an example globally of where this is happening. I even, when I was at COP27 in Egypt, and I had the opportunity to have a discussion with some of the super majors have formed the OGCI, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. And when they heard what we were doing and the size of the investment that it's going to take, they actually said to me, wow, like that is huge, that's impressive. And this is coming from an organization of super majors. And so I think that the fact that we're in Calgary and we have this gigantic resource in our backyards here in Alberta, and the fact that we all kind of know each other here in Calgary, And we're able to overcome it. I mean, with COSIA, Canada's Oil Sands Innovation Alliance, we started down this path years ago already, this collaboration for environmental good. And so that's number one, because it is hard to get companies to work together and put aside their individual competitive advantage. And we've had to, Amberly talked about the 200 plus, I think you're right, it's way more than that, number of people from our companies working on pathways. We have to keep reminding them. I meet every week with just the Cenovus people, and we say, okay, you guys, now, this isn't how you would normally go into a negotiation with our peers over a different project. You have to remember the greater good is that we're trying to progress decarbonization fast. And so that's number one. The second part is that this is a shared goal with the province, with our industry, with the province, and with the Canadian government. Decarbonization is the outcome that everybody is looking to achieve. And there's no way that Canada will be able to achieve its very aggressive climate targets without our sector. So the oil sands alone is, depending on which year you look at, 10 or 12% of Canada's GHG emissions, just the oil sands, and the broader sector is over a quarter of the emissions of Canada, just from the production. And so there is a realization at all levels of government that we do have to work together as partners. So again, I go back to that collaboration. We have to work together as partners to get there, because otherwise Canada won't achieve its goals either. And so no matter what you're hearing, sometimes there is the political rhetoric that you're talking about. But I have to say, behind the scenes and in the actual meetings where there's work happening, from the ministerial level down to, deputy ministers, ADMs, and the staff at both levels of government, we're having really good conversations. And we have been, over the last couple of years. And everybody is really trying to figure out, how do we progress this faster? Because you think it's hard for our companies, or unique for our companies, to work together in this way, in this much of a collaborative effort. Government departments do not work together. Everybody thinks that they do. Oh my God, they're actually, we're hearing things like, we've never had this kind of multi-departmental collaboration, and Pathways Alliance is forcing that. And so I think that those are two of the big hows, and I think Amberly can talk a little bit more about the hows of the pathways of technology. But to me, that collaborative effort with governments and amongst our industry, and we haven't even talked about the clean tech sector that's set up shop here in this city. I mean, that's a huge part. Now, there's no money to be made by our companies. This is a cost to our companies, but there's a lot of money to be made with the technology providers and the service sector. This is carbon capture and storage alone, put aside small modular reactors and other things. That is this province's next construction boom. It is very clear to me. I'm going to be quiet for a second.
Well, I can tell the enthusiasm here for collaboration. So Amberly, carrying on, what are the roles of the provincial and federal governments in collaboration with Pathways Alliance, and maybe a little bit in terms of where the financing is going to come from?
For sure. I mean, when you look at forecasts for demand for energy going forward, there is a big chunk of that that's still hydrocarbon based. But that's all predicated on the ability to decarbonize those hydrocarbon production units. So working with government and collaborating and forcing a little bit of extra collaboration within the government is a key piece of that puzzle. Things like the investment tax credit that was announced for CCUS in Canada is fantastic. It's a big piece of what we're looking for in order to enable us to make those investment decisions within the respective companies of the Pathways Alliance. But there's probably a little bit more needed. We're trying to be competitive with other major energy production countries. So places like Norway and the Netherlands have done substantive investment in CCUS. They're looking to collaborate with the industry people there and drive those innovations and those incentives to put the CO2 back into the ground. Similarly, we're looking at the US. They've got the 45Q under the investment tax credits, and part of that is incenting CCUS investment in the US. We need to have similar incentives in Canada. It doesn't need to be the same, and frankly, it probably shouldn't, because we have a different system in Canada, we have different challenges, and we have different opportunities. But we're looking to make sure that the decarbonization dollars are invested in Canada and not other places around the world. And so a big piece of collaborating with government is making sure we have those fiscal frameworks in place so that those decarbonization dollars get spent here. And so we're spending money not just on CCUS, but also the investment tax credit for clean technologies. So looking at how can we incent other technologies? How can we incent different types of energy? In the oil sands sector, we're using a huge chunk of energy. We use natural gas, we use electricity. It's all part of our process. And we need that decarbonized as well in order to enable us to reach all of these goals and objectives that have been set. So there's a big piece of working on fiscal frameworks with government, because right now you can't install a modular nuclear reactor in the oil sands, not only because it's expensive, but because there's not an approval process yet. So we need the fiscal frameworks, and then we need the regulatory frameworks with government, both Alberta government and the federal government, in order to make it possible to even get to where we're going. And I'm going to add one more thing. I know you said succinct, Dr. Bob, but I'm going to go on. The one other thing I'll mention is we're talking about a huge shift in the way we're doing things globally and in Canada. And if you think about the fact that I mentioned the foundational project, it's a huge construction project, one of the bigger ones that we've had in a long time here in Alberta. Can you imagine the resources we need to staff that? We need engineers, we need pipe guys, we need all sorts of people. That is competing now with other clean technologies that are being advanced and other projects and things that are being developed and built in Alberta and Canada. So we also need government support and the support of universities and our companies to make sure that we have the resources, the human resources in place to support the fiscal investment and the regulatory frameworks that we need. And that is all I will say on that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go off script here for just a little bit. One of the things that's going to happen here is that there are going to be other universities in Canada and the world that want to write this up. So I'm going to do a pitch right now for the Haskayne School of Business. If you get a call from anyone who wants to write up what you're doing in Pathways or your own company, here we are. We're the Haskayne School of Business. We actually have the best research in the world for the Carbon Disclosure Project. And the head of that is my faculty colleague, Amberly, who is just coming off one of the top journals in the world. But this is all data-driven. We have the best database in the world on the Carbon Disclosure Project. So if someone says we'd like to write an article, no, Haskayne School of Business, if they want to work with us, we'd be happy to do that. Okay, but we don't want someone to come in and scoop the stories that are global. In addition to that, we have another opportunity, things I'm working on, to have Calgary and Alberta as a global part of the energy transition with other places in the world. That's already underway. So there's lots of things that we're doing. So if you hear other people that want to come in and try to steal what's happening here, I'm competitive too. Okay, and I'm competitive for Alberta and Calgary. I think this is our chance to be on the global stage for doing really good things. So I have my off stage here. So now we're open for questions. We have some extra time for questions. Yes, Yuri. Yeah, we got a microphone coming here, so.
Thank you everybody for a very interesting discussion. My name is Yuri Koskin and I'm a professor of finance at the Haskayne School of Business. So both Amberly and Rhona, you mentioned that there is no money to be made from CCS or CCUS. I don't really understand that comment because you do have carbon taxes in Canada and Alberta. So by doing CCS, you will avoiding taxes, and that is cash flow to the companies involved. So would you care to comment that?
Yeah, so you're right, and that is also unique in Canada, our carbon tax system, compared to when we're looking at some of these other jurisdictions. The projects that we're looking at, I mean, we didn't even go through the list of all the pathways and the different types of projects. So there are certain projects on the list that do make economic sense right away. But the bigger ones, and maybe we'll just talk carbon capture and storage for now, these are multi-billion-dollar projects, and that's just the upfront capital for them. And then the operating costs over the years are significant as well. And that's what we're talking to governments about. It's not just about the upfront capital. You know, these will be running for decades. And so, you know, somehow we can't be burdened with the extra operating costs and longer-term sustaining capital costs that our peers around the globe don't have. So yes, decarbonization is great, our investors would like us to do that, but there has to be, where's that balance between how much we can put in, how much our companies can invest or add to our costs to decarbonize, while at the same time, yes, having a better product. So anyone that's in marketing in this room right now, you know, if we can get a better price for our decarbonized oil, that would be the end goal. That would be wonderful. But I don't think we're quite there yet. And so the carbon, you're right, we pay carbon costs, but it's not, that would cover, and whatever you want to talk about, the government, the federal government is talking about contracts for difference, and we might get some more detail from them. And what that is a guaranteed price, because the market right now is not robust enough, and we're a very small industry in Canada, very small in Canada overall, to be able to provide enough offsetting credits to offset the long-term costs. And so that is one aspect. We've been talking to the governments all along over the last couple of years about stacking different funding mechanisms. So some of that is, you know, the carbon credits. Some of that is the ITC, the investment tax credit. Some of that is grants to get some of these really brand new technologies off the ground. Provincially, that could look like a couple of different things we're talking about. It could look like putting into the royalty system. It could look like an expansion to the Alberta Petrochemical Incentive Program, APIP. And so the carbon tax and the carbon credits alone aren't enough, but they're one element of it. And so that's when we talk about costs. Again, our companies are willing to put in billions of dollars of our own. We're committed to doing that for this decarbonization. We don't expect the government to pay for all of this, but we can't pay for all of it either, or we become uncompetitive. And, you know, there is a point where investors, again, it's that we haven't quite figured out where that balance is. Investors haven't figured out where that balance is between wanting their investments to be low carbon in the energy sector and still wanting to make returns. You know, we've had investors with us over the last, and everybody is fully aware we're in earnings season right now, and you're all seeing the headlines about how much our companies made last year. But that was last year. If you go back a couple of years, the headlines were much different for our companies. And so we've been climbing out of debt as companies, and we've started to give money back to our shareholders who were very patient with us over the last couple of years, and they were getting their dividends cut and making, you know, no returns. Or very, very few returns. And so again, it is that balance, and it is an interesting time when the public sees you guys are making so much money, why do you need anything from the government? But, you know, if anyone in this room could predict for me that oil is going to be $100 per barrel over, you know, between now and 2050, that's wonderful. But you know, we all know the cycles of commodities, and so we do need some stability to be able to invest in these projects. I think that was a longer answer than the question actually asked for. What did I miss, Amberly, though?
I was going to say, you nailed it. I would go with ditto, I think, on that one.
Okay, now, if you have, yes, a question over here. So if you have other questions, just put your hand up, and then we'll know where to go next. So introduce yourself and what your question is.
So my name is Andrea Osmond. I'm with Carbon Connect International. And I'm just going to go back to something you mentioned. I like the competitive spirit. I'm very competitive myself. And so when I think about the global, you know, being on the global stage and leading with all of the things that we're doing by the people in this room, Rhonda, you mentioned OGCI. Is there a reason, you know, and I'm curious what you think it might be, you know, Canadian companies are noticeably absent from things like OGCI, OGMP, and some of these other international groups. And I'm wondering why you think that might be. Is it we're heads down solving problems? Is it because we're competitive and we don't want anyone else to scoop us and we want to get ahead? But I'm curious what your thoughts are and why we want to be global leaders, but we're not part of some of those global groups.
Yeah, so OGCI in particular, we looked at it when they first announced after Paris. We were too small. Like it was more about, you know, what their expectations were for when they set it up, and you know, OGMP, all these acronyms these days. But the methane commitments, I mean, I think we're actually there. We're doing it already, and so we're, you know, as Cenovus, what's one of the things that we've looked into is whether that makes sense for us to officially join. So I don't think there's a particular reason. I mean, some of it we just didn't qualify. I think we were big enough, when you look at Pathways Alliance, then we become a force because we have a lot of production. But as individual companies on the global scale, we were all still pretty small. So that's really the reason. I don't think, it's not, we were doing so much here in Canada, even with, I'll go back to Canada's Oil Sands Innovation Alliance. It's 12 years ago, 13 years ago now.
10.
10? Okay, I'm giving it more. But we were used as an example globally at that time even, and so COSIA is now part of the broader Pathways bucket, and Amberly explained a little bit about that. But we were used as an example, and globally others came to us to say, how did you actually break down all these the IP challenges and the sharing of environmental knowledge and technology with each other? And so we have been on a global stage, I think, and so there's nothing that's us saying we don't want to be part of some of those initiatives. We just, sometimes we don't qualify to be part of them, or sometimes we're so focused right now on getting our emissions reductions action actually underway that we just haven't joined up for some of them.
So you're going to get the next two questions.
Apparently, yeah. Make them easy ones, okay?
So just as a commentary, one of my former students said that part of the reason why Calgary in particular is very successful at the global stage is because in about 8 blocks by 4 blocks, everyone knows each other. And the velocity of doing deals is faster in Calgary than any place else in the world. Because if someone tries to take too much, the word gets out by the afternoon. And so the lawyers all have standard operating agreements, and they put little stickies on there so the other lawyers would know where to go look, and you actually speed things up. So the lawyers, the geologists, the accountants, everyone knows each other. They still are looking after their client, but the idea of doing more and better and bigger deals is basically what has been transpired as well with Pathways, at least in my opinion. So anything else you want to add there?
No, we'll face the next two very easy questions.
Okay, yes.
I'm enthusiastic about carbon capture, and I see the Alberta government enthusiastic about it, but on the federal political level, I just don't see that enthusiasm. Do you see the enthusiasm in the federal government, the bureaucracy level?
That's a great question. So from a bureaucracy level, there's an appetite to get to where we need to go. I don't know if everyone is convinced that carbon capture is the right answer. And I think if you walk in, maybe not in Calgary, but if you hit some of the streets in Canada and asked if carbon capture was the answer, I'm not sure everyone would agree that that's the right solution. However, we see at Pathways anyway, that it's a big part of the solution. And I think one of the things we haven't used our rhetoric yet, so I will throw it out there. It's not the pathway to net zero, it's the pathways to net zero. So clearly, substantive investment in carbon capture and storage, because you're right, it's a big part of the puzzle, at least in our opinion. It gives us that opportunity. It's a proven technology. We can deploy it almost immediately. Investment cycles, long lead engineering, et cetera, taken into consideration. But we can do it soon. It's there, the technology's there. In Alberta, we're uniquely positioned with an awesome reservoir, or a number of awesome reservoirs to stick the CO2 back into the ground through. But it's not the only way we're gonna get to net zero. And so I think a lot of the federal government focus is not all the eggs in one basket, and it's what are the other technologies we need? What are the other solutions? What are the other pieces of the puzzle that will help Canada as a whole get to that net zero ambition? And that's, we've mentioned a few of them, but things like solvent technologies in the in situ industry. It's, electrification of our mine fleets in the oil sands mines. It's small modular reactors to power the boilers that we need to heat the water to make steam for our in situ developments. There's a whole bunch of pieces that we're looking at from our perspective for that net zero ambition, and different technologies and different opportunities. And globally, and in Canada for sure, there's also different things in different sectors that they're looking at. And so I think you get a little bit of a variance of focuses within the federal government, because they're not just, we're looking at the oil sands, so we're kind of special. We get to look at one specific thing and problem solve that. The bureaucracy within the federal government has to look at all of the range of options to help Canada meet those goals. And so it's a bit of a broader focus. And so maybe it's not as laser, I don't want to say laser because that's a technology too, but it's not as tightly focused in on the CCUS as perhaps we are able to be here in Alberta.
Although, they did introduce the investment tax credit, not just for our sector, for CCS in particular. And so that does show that they do see that as a solution.
Okay, we have another question in the back there.
Yes, thank you. I've really enjoyed the discussion so far. My question actually might lead to an elaboration over what has already been discussed, but I agree, Pathways is world class. It is very unique, and it is challenging a lot of paradigms in competition, in scale, in breadth of scope of technology advancement. So there's an opportunity there to actually use that to sell Alberta energy. So is there a strategy or plan to change the narrative both within Canada and internationally about the industry here? And what would that look like if there is one?
I'll start. So you may have heard our advertisements on the radio or during the Super Bowl. I know because my husband called me down to see it. Not that I wasn't watching the game. Anyway, the point being, traditionally, our sector has been criticized for not talking about what we're doing. And certainly on an international stage, no one can know what's happening in the Alberta oil sands if the folks in the Alberta oil sands aren't talking about it in Alberta. And so one of the big things that the Pathways Alliance has done, and our comms team should get lots of credit for this, is they've really tried to work with the companies, and for the first time, collaboratively, the companies are saying, okay, yeah, we can talk about that a lot more than we have historically. And so a big piece of it is getting that message out. So it's starting with, what is the Pathways Alliance? What are we trying to accomplish? What is our plan? And as soon as we can get that message out, and to be honest, bring on board folks like yourselves to understand what we're trying to accomplish, whether you agree or not, it doesn't really matter. If you're talking about it and sharing that information, it gets that conversation going, and then that allows us to elevate up through the Alberta public and make awareness here, make awareness across Canada. My mother gets the ads in British Columbia, so we're increasing that awareness across Alberta, across Canada, and then that allows us to position ourselves to share more on the global stage, which then allows people to recognize what we have here in Canada and the product that we're selling, and how we, as an organization as a collection of companies, are really trying to produce responsibly produced oil. It meets the ESG metrics, including the climate change metrics. And so if we can do that and communicate that out and have people talking about it, that allows us to get to that place where internationally, hopefully, we're recognized as maybe the best barrel of oil there is.
Yeah, and I mean, even beyond Canada, we've been, I personally have been to Europe talking to investors, insurers, lenders over there, across different North American places, global. I mean, we had a Pathways Alliance panel in Egypt at COP27. And so we definitely are making an attempt to have these conversations globally to say, look at what we're doing in Canada, take us seriously. And I've had nothing but very, very positive feedback. I mean, of course, our investors are very supportive of what we're doing. And then the next question is, okay, so how much is this going to cost your companies, and how much is the government truly committed? I mean, that is a question. I've never had so many investor questions about government policy as I have over the last couple of years about, is the government truly going to be a partner with you financially in these and get the regulatory regimes in place? And so I think that everywhere that we go, when we talk about it, it is seen as a very positive, but we're at the stage, like we've been talking about it, I have to be clear, we didn't start talking about it until we made a commitment to action. We had a plan before we went public with that plan, because this isn't a public relations exercise. While we have advertising out there, this is about action. That's what we're focused on, not about the PR side of it, but they have to go hand in hand, because you're not going to have policy change or get support for what you're doing unless you actually have people that know about it.
Next question.
Just a question around further to that. You mentioned contract for difference a little earlier on, Rhona, and just wanted to expand a little bit more on that. We've got a $170 carbon price that's projected out towards the end of the decade. It's gradually increasing to that. And how do you see the kind of certainty of preservation of that? We know things are changing a lot in politics, and things can be quite fickle. Things can move in different directions. What do you see as the likelihood of that sticking, or the potential for it to deviate, and how would that affect investment decisions over the next decade or so?
Sure, I think you have a really good point. It's planned, it's predicted out into the future, and that's what I think, to the original question that we started off with. That is one of the challenges, is you're making investment decisions now, spending billions of dollars, And what that looks like in terms of the carbon price in the future is uncertain. It's a market. And there's pieces of that we don't know yet. And that's where we're looking to work with government in order to get a little bit more certainty into our investment, because those are not necessarily guaranteed or fixed. And so that's a big piece of the fiscal framework that we're looking for, and the supports that we're looking for from the federal and provincial government is to give a little bit more certainty for our investors as we make those decisions and plan out what we look like in the future.
No, absolutely. And we're not, all of the ideas that have been tossed around right now about potential opportunities to finance from the government side of it, those are all great. Like, we're not, sometimes we're criticized, oh, you guys keep asking for more. We're actually not asking for more different mechanisms. We're just asking for the details about what these mechanisms are. I mean, even the investment tax credit, it was announced a long time ago, and the details still aren't worked out. So we don't know how it will actually work. Contracts for difference has been brought up, and that's great, and we agree with that, but we just don't know how it's going to work. And so, those of you who have done major projects, for companies like ours to invest billions of dollars, it is a very robust process. We need to know timelines and costs, or you're not going to get past, I don't know which stage gate you're going to get past without timelines and costs, but it's not very far along the investment approval process. And so, we keep hearing, go faster. You guys are not, you keep talking about it, but you're not doing anything. We're doing a lot. I mean, even just for the foundational carbon capture and storage project, just the pipeline and hub, we've done 12 feasibility studies for capture and shared those feasibility studies with our peers, all of us. We're out there doing environmental work. That takes a whole year because you need the entire cycle of winter, summer, spring just to do the environmental assessments. But we're doing that. So we've done engineering work on the pipeline. We're getting towards an application for this pipeline and hub. But people that don't live in this world of major projects don't understand there are a whole bunch of steps that have to be taken before you just start putting a pipeline in the ground. We haven't even talked about Indigenous engagement. That's a huge part of what we're doing right now, is working with multiple communities at the same time that are along that. This is a huge region that we're going to be putting this pipeline through. And so I feel huge urgency. I'm not very good with patience. As a person, I've worked on it for many years and I've given up because I'm 50. But I feel huge urgency, and government works slowly, and they keep saying your companies aren't doing anything, but it's kind of like a cart before the horse here. We still need some more certainty from the governments, and they're on the right track. We're not criticizing them for that, but it just takes time. And so everybody wants to see shovels in the ground, but we have to do this the right way, and we have to do this because this is our shareholders' money that we're talking about. We can't just be throwing it out there with the best hope that over the long run this isn't going to cost us so much that we become uncompetitive and our shareholders go elsewhere in the world to places that might be not as aggressive with their decarbonization efforts. We should be getting rewarded. I feel strongly that we should be getting rewarded for the action that we're taking. And I'm not sure yet that the markets globally have actually put their money where their mouth is when it comes to actually rewarding companies that are taking this action.
Yes. Oh, 2 questions, Yuri. Okay. Well, well, you go for it.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. I owe you one now. So, Rhona, you mentioned that,
Just hold the microphone up.
if you're successful, you should get credit for these initiatives. So think about that. Maybe 2030, 2035, you've been successful. You've reduced your emissions by 40%, 45%. What if people change goalposts? They said, okay, you're only talking about scope 1, scope 2 emissions, and we know that 80% of the emissions are scope 3. So let's imagine when 2035, you said, oh, you've done great, you reduce emissions by, let's say, even by 50%, fantastic success, and then somebody says, but hey, you haven't done anything about scope 3 emissions. And the world has changed, and then you still might get slammed for that. So there's, in a sense, there's enormous risks going on this. Nothing might be enough, and nothing might be enough by 2050, even if you get to 0 emissions, because then we still have the huge scope 3 emissions. So this is a tricky situation. Maybe the optimal situation is, oh my God, I mean, we're really stuck with this.
Yeah, the bar that keeps moving.
So you might want to define scope 3. That's what comes out of people's tailpipe, right?
Yeah, so you're right, it's 80%. So the majority of the emissions come from the use of the product, and our scope 3 emissions are somebody else's scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And so if everybody in the world addressed their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, then scope 3 is automatically addressed in that way. I will say that, and my team is right here, and they're looking at me because scope 3 is my least favorite topic to talk about. But it is a challenge, and the bar does keep rising. I guess in the end, though, I mean, scope 3 is scope 3 for any barrel of oil around the world. I mean, if it's being, after it's produced and there's a airplane with jet fuel using their jet fuel at scope 3, it doesn't really much matter if initially was from the oil sands or wherever. One thing I would say about the oil sands in particular, because it's heavy oil, some of the harder to abate fuels are the kind that our heavier oil actually makes, like jet fuel, for example, is more use. I'm not going to get into a refining discussion right now, but so there for sure is going to be fewer personal vehicles using fuel in the future. I mean, nobody's denying that. There are going to be more electric vehicles, but the scope 3 discussion, that's fine. They can say, well, you still have associated scope 3 in 2040, but if oil is still being used, I would say, okay, if oil is still being used, where do you want to choose it from? And so it's all about supply and demand in the end. If there is zero demand for our oil, then our companies will have by then pivoted and started doing something else. There's no forecast. There's no forecast. Even the most aggressive decarbonization forecasts still show 24 million barrels per day of oil being used in 2050 to 40 million barrels per day, the aggressive ones. And so Canada right now, if we're still producing 5 million, 6 million barrels per day, then we should be part of that 24, 40, 100, whatever you think that's going to be in 2050, but there's going to be oil in 2050. When I ask these questions of people that are more critical of our sector, and I say, do you really feel there's going to be zero oil needed in 2050? I have never had anybody tell me that. And so
there won't be any plastics then.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
that's the other thing. I mean, the demand for everything that is made from petrochemicals is going up in that time too.
Yeah, and I think the other piece is it comes back to the collaboration discussion, right? We're taking the steps that are within the controls of the major oil sands companies to reduce and eliminate the scope 1 and 2 emissions. That's actually predicated on someone else eliminating their emissions upstream as well, right? So we're also using electricity and things like that. The scope 3 emissions is going to be a collaboration. And in this case, it's not a collaboration between the oil sands companies. It's a collaboration between all of the people that are using the oil sands products and the governments and the incentives that they can put in place to move us towards that as well, right? It's a big piece. And there are no forecasts that show no oil in the future. So.
But that said, for scope 3, our companies are, as individual companies, these are business choices. And so, Cenovus has ethanol and a lot of asphalt production. That doesn't have scope 3 associated with it. We're one of North America's largest asphalt producers from our refining business. And, Imperial, Suncor, all like the CNRL, all of our companies are actually doing something when it comes to scope 3 as well. We're in that business too. So we're not ignoring that. But we're also being realistic that there's still going to be a need for oil in the future.
So I see Deborah has the last question. So please.
Uh-oh.
No, we'll be
Sorry, we're out of time.
You've talked about the investment tax credits. You've talked about contract for differences. But I'm just curious as to whether you can speak to the importance of the role of government in de-risking the technologies that are being developed and what that looks like and what else we need to see in that context.
Sure. I mean, there is a role for government. They've obviously recognized that. There's the ITC for clean technology. We anticipate there'll be some additional incentives for other types of technology as they emerge. The biggest challenge that we face in the non-known technologies is developing them for starts, and then getting approval to use them. I mentioned small modular reactors initially, and I'll say again, there's not currently a regulatory framework for that to happen. So we're looking at it at Pathways, but we're not actually sure how we're going to get it approved yet, and that'll be another piece that has to happen from a regulatory de-risking perspective, and then from the fiscal de-risking perspective, maybe Rhona, I'll toss it to you.
Yeah, and I'm looking at Joy from CNRL right now, and there's this government funding that's gone to CRIN, the Clean Resource Innovation Network as well. And so I think the challenge with the government funding is that governments understand that they need to help de-risk some of these things that are too risky for publicly traded companies to put a lot of money. Where the companies are useful, and I'm talking all over the place, but where we're useful is that we're the testing ground. We're the live labs to take these technologies and actually test them out, because that's what's hard for a lot of the technology developers, is actually getting it tested. And I'm looking at Kevin over there from Avatar Innovations, everybody in the room, there's so much technology being tested. And so the challenge in Canada, I think, is that there's so many different government organizations that are offering funding, a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here. And so, even in Alberta, we've got Alberta Innovates, we've got Emissions Reduction Alberta, both great. And other funding mechanisms from different government departments. At the federal level, we've got ISET, Innovation, Science, Economic Development. We've got, the Canadian Infrastructure Bank has some funding. We've got SDTC, Sustainable Development Technology Canada. We've got these little buckets of money all over the place, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of applications and a lot of reports back to government on how you've spent this money to actually get enough money that's needed to move some of these projects forward. Because, we have Evoke Innovations that we founded, but it is very time consuming. So I think that our system probably needs to be adjusted so that these tiny buckets of money that are everywhere there's a way that those government funders get together and are able to collaborate and make it easier for technology developers and companies that need the technology to work together and just move forward, because we're going to get left in the dust. When you look at what's happening south of the border right now, I am so nervous that all of our great technology that's being developed here in Calgary is going to head down there with the Inflation Reduction Act incentives that are happening. So I'm nervous about that.
So I want to thank our panelists, Rhona and Amberly. And to wrap us up, and thank all of you, Dean Jim DeWalt.
Thanks, Bob, and thank you so much for your always fantastic job as moderator of the panel. Just a couple of comments. I want to note, I should have introduced some of our folks who are here. Of course, Dr. Bob, you all know the work that he does in the energy industry and in training our students. Jyrki Koskinen, who had a couple of questions, which is great. If you don't know him, he is the BMO Chair for Sustainable Finance. He's a world expert on ESG and how it's treated in financial markets. And Bob had also mentioned Alain Verbeek is here, who is the lead of our strategy group and a world-renowned expert in international strategy and taking the lead on many of our ESG initiatives. Our school is quite committed to this area. People who, like you will hear on the radio, Kristen Van den Biesenbos and Sarah Sue Duran, we have lots of people who are working in this area, and it's important that we keep this connection going. I want to give you just another reason why this conversation is so important. One thing that we've noticed, and I think it's sort of hit with 2014, the big sharp drop in oil pricing and the resultant impact on many of the firms here. It's very hard now, maybe that's overstating it, but our students don't have the interest in the energy industry that they once had. And this is a serious challenge for our city because there isn't a scenario around that doesn't show the industry having an impact. But it's got to become more sensitive, more techy. It's got to present itself in a different way to attract these young people to go further. So the work that Amberly and Rhona are doing is so critical in so many ways to our city and to our country. And I just want to join Dr. Bob in thanking them so much for what they do and for coming out here this morning. I also want to thank our team led by Jess Bergen and Lasha Hashe, the great work that they've done in organizing this, the Weston catering staff and the AV staff. Great, thanks everybody for doing that. Thank you for coming. One very important job for you is that you will get a link in your email, feedback survey. Please take the time to do it because these surveys really help us to position future events. This is obviously a popular topic, and it came out of somebody's comment on a survey, so let's keep those ideas flowing. And if you are interested in being a part of our school and helping out with our students or the different initiatives we have, please go to our website or stop me or one of our folks here, and we'd be happy to get you more involved. Have a great day. Thank you so much for coming. All the best.